Welcome to the First Time Facilitator podcast. Whether you're a first-time facilitator or a seasoned pro, listen in for tips and tricks to make a bigger impact at the next workshop you deliver. And now, your host. She cringes when people say I'm not creative because she thinks everyone is, Leanne Hughes.
Hello and welcome to the First Time Facilitator podcast. I'm your host, Leanne Hughes, and I'm here to help you develop and deliver workshops that kill. Now, if it's your first time listening to the show, welcome. And for those subscribers, it's amazing to have you back. And I love that you're taking the time out to improve your craft. If you want to connect up with like-minded listeners, join our community on Facebook. It's called The Flip Chart. We have listeners from all walks of life and locations delivering all different workshops. But what we have in common is that we're all interested in cool tips, tricks, and ideas to make our workshops more engaging and powerful. Simply search for The Flip Chart in Facebook, or the link for it's in the show notes. Now, I'm super excited to introduce today's guest. If you've been listening to the show in the last couple of months, you would have heard me talk about the We Are podcast conference quite a bit. I just had an incredible time both at the conference and at the speakers retreat. And after seeing this guest speak at the conference, I knew I had to have him on the show. His name is Dave Jackson. He is an award-winning podcaster who has been podcasting since April 2005 and has been the host of nearly a dozen different podcasts over the last decade. He's best known as the host of School of Podcasting, where he's helped thousands of new and experienced podcasters launch their shows and become better hosts. Now, I hit him up for this interview when I was driving him, Alison Melody from Food Hills, and Pat Flynn from the Smart Passive Income podcast from the Gold Coast to Brisbane at 6 a.m. There was like a crazy amount of traffic and we were all feeling extremely weary after a massive, massive week. So it was really lovely for Dave to accept the opportunity and deliver on that commitment by having this interview. He's a real legend. Now, he's been a speaker for many years at the New Media Expo podcast movement, Podfest, MapCon, and other conventions. Most people chat to Dave about creating or improving their podcast, but I really wanted to focus on the fact that he has been a technical trainer for over 20 years. I also like that he says in his bio that this means that he not only understands technology, but he can explain it in a plain English, geek-speak free environment. Now, in this episode, we explore why it's important to get out of your comfort zone, how Dave has brought his experience playing in a band on stages into the way that he presents, what he does to make his presentations more engaging, how he handles his nerves before he presents. And it's really funny, I had no idea he actually had nerves because he comes across just so confident. And we also explore why he's just so damn funny. I hope you find this conversation enjoyable and helpful. Show notes for the episode are at firsttimefacilitator.com/episode 42. Now, on to the show. Dave Jackson, you're a podcasting legend, and it's an absolute delight to have a conversation with you today. Thanks for joining us on the First Time Facilitator podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
It's great to have you here. Look, as everyone knows, or maybe you don't know, but Dave is a podcasting Hall of Famer. He started podcasting way back in 2005, I believe.
Yep.
But you had a bit of a life before then, didn't you? There was a life before podcasting where you worked in various different roles that led you here. I was wondering if you could talk about your career pivots that led you to go down the path of podcasting and what you're doing now.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. My original degree was in electronic engineering, and I thought I wanted to go out and fix stuff. So I actually was a copier technician, which is not a great job because everybody you run into is upset because their copier doesn't work. And I did that for about 2 years. And the manager at the time was he was like probably 6'4", just a big guy and just kind of intimidating. And for whatever reason, I would just go up and talk to him and, water cooler talk, nothing too crazy. And after about 2 years, he said, "Hey, I have a position for you that I'm going to invent." And I'm like, "Okay." And he goes, "You seem to like to talk." And he goes, "We have our customers. We have this great equipment. We have a great sales staff, but our customers are breaking it because they don't know how to run it." And he said, we want you to go out, set up the equipment, use your technical side, and then we want you to teach them how to run the equipment, and then more importantly, show them how to not run the equipment so they don't break it. And so that made customer, like, I don't know, service call that was inspired because the customer didn't know what they were doing. And those like took a huge nosedive, and they're like, whoa, you seem to be pretty good at that. And then they asked me, do you know anything about computers? And that then began probably 25 years of me teaching a lot of Microsoft Office and QuickBooks, as well as things like time management and customer service and you name it. And over the years, what's interesting is in the corporate world, they will hire salespeople that for whatever reason can't sell. And so when sales takes a nosedive, they look at the training department and we are just like a giant bullseye. And so I've had it happen 3 times where they go, you're one of our best trainers, but we just don't have the business. And I'm thinking, how about hiring new sales guys? But instead they let the training staff go. So that happened like the 3rd time. And I was like, plus I actually saw where I was going to get replaced by a phone. I had a student once in a class and I was teaching Microsoft Excel. And they said, have you ever used these 2 features together? And I said, that's a good question. I did the teacher thing. And I said, hey, let's write that on the board and we'll talk about that on break. And as I wrote it on the board, he asked his phone and got an answer. And I remember thinking, I'm going to get replaced by a phone. It's just a matter of time. And sure enough, it took about 2 years. But sure enough, once again, called into the office, you're one of our best trainers, but we got to let you go. And I was like, I'm really tired. And in between there, I actually went back and got a teaching degree. And because that was one of the hurdles. Once you get laid off and you go to get a job in teaching, they go, your degree's in electronic engineering. So I was like, all right. So I went back to school and got that degree. So I kept jumping through hoops, and I'm like, the whole goal of this is not to lose your job. And I'm like, I'm tired of hearing you're great, but we're going to let you go. And so the last time I had been let go, I had been a customer for a podcast media hosting company called Libsyn, and I knew what was then the vice president, and I called him up and said, I've got bad news and good news. And he's like, what's the bad news? And I'm like, I just lost my job. And he's like, okay, I'll bite. What's the good news? And I said, I'm available to work for you, buddy. And lo and behold, 2 weeks later, I now work from home. I make more money than I did when I worked in the corporate world, and where I used to have to take a vacation day or whatever to go to these different events, I now get paid to go to those. So it's really quite the dream job for me, and I just love it.
Yeah, and you get to fly to places like Australia and speak at conferences there.
That's it. It's a lot of fun. I'm going to Washington, D.C. in a couple days to speak at an event there, and all sorts of I've been to San Diego. That's the first time out of the country was Australia. But and what that does is that puts me knee deep in front of my target audience. So it's always flattering when somebody comes up and says, hey, I listen to your show. I love it. I'm like, oh, thank you so much. But then I always ask, what would you like to hear? Or is there something I'm doing that you wish I didn't do? I'm always looking for some sort of constructive feedback, because that's my audience. And you have every form of communication there, not just like written word. I've got body language. I've got tone of voice. I'm like, I can really read my client there, my potential customer. And so I always love to talk to them and find out what they're struggling with, anything there that I can use to make better content, because that's who I'm trying to reach through my podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you kind of undersell yourself. You're a bit of a celebrity in the podcasting world. You mentioned recently, was it you went to Ohio and you had people drive in just to meet with you and talk to you. So it's probably really nice as well. A bit of motivation for your podcast when you get people coming up to you and saying great things about your show and how they heard of you.
It's fun. I was in San Diego once, and I was walking down the hall, and this woman looked up and said, oh, wow. And I turned behind me and there was nobody behind me. And I'm like, what? And she goes, you're Dave Jackson. I'm like, I am. And she's like, oh my God. And so she had like a total fanboy moment. And it was like, yeah, it's just me. It's not a big deal, but it's very flattering.
It is. And I love that story of the 2 years of water cooler chat and how it actually wound up. You got your career pivot and your next opportunity just through a conversation with a guy over 2 years. Isn't that fascinating? It just shows the power of being able to communicate. Yeah,
and where it was is I worked in the city called Canton, Ohio, and if you're into American football, you recognize that because that's where the NFL has their Hall of Fame. So that city is just bonkers for American football. So I would just come in on Monday and go, did you see the game last night? And that would just set that guy off for 10 minutes. And I'm not really that much of a sports guy, but it was just enough to listen, and I would crack a few jokes, and he just, for whatever reason, seemed to like me. So that was, I really didn't do much to develop that relationship, besides the fact that everybody's like, well, his name was Greg. I'm like, well, that's Greg, man. He could fire you. And I'm like, yeah, I know that, but I'm not. And it wasn't like overtly trying to, suck up to the guy. I was just like, what's up, Greg? He's just a guy, And so, yeah. And what was really nice is when I got let go of that particular situation, I'd been there 10 years. And what happened is they moved me into a position, and then I was using a piece of software, and then the company decided they weren't going to use the software. And they're like, oh, what are we going to do with Dave? And he was really nice. He actually brought me into his office, and I had actually been offered another job from another company. He said, I heard you got a job offer. And I'm like, yeah, but I love it here. And he goes, you might want to look into that. And I went, really? And he goes, you know what? It's really nice outside. This would be a great time to take your vacation. And I went, really? And he goes, I'm trying to do everything I can. So he was very polite of kind of saying, hey, you know how you kind of ran out of things to do here? You're probably going to get let go. So he was really nice to kind of let me know the writing on the wall. So those relationships can really come in handy.
Yeah, they can. And like you said, it's not going in with any sort of expectation. It's just curiosity, asking questions, and paying someone out about their team, I think, is great. So you got the School of Podcasting now, and in the past you were teaching technical skills related to Microsoft Office and fun systems like that. I like that you brought up the concept of edutainment, so mixing education with entertainment, and that's something that I see that you do extremely well, which is why I wanted you on the show. How did you coin that phrase, or what is it about entertainment that really helps people retain knowledge?
I think what inspired me is, I don't know if I coined it. I used it a lot, and then I saw it on the internet. I'm like, okay, maybe I didn't invent that phrase, but I have a niece who was just like spooky smart, where you kind of like, shouldn't you be playing with Barbies? And she's over there, whatever, splitting atoms or something for fun. She was insanely smart. And I remember it's right when computers first, like computer learning, you'd pop in a DVD, and I think it was something like, Roger Rabbit Teaches Reading or whatever. And she's just in there laughing and having a good old time. And I walk in, I go, what you doing? And she's like, oh, I'm playing with Roger. And I see I don't know, at the time she was like probably in kindergarten, and she was doing like math tables. And I'm like, wait a minute, I didn't even know half this stuff when I was her age. And it just dawned on me, I'm like, if you make this fun, people don't mind learning. It doesn't seem so much like school. And I had a teacher in college that would just come in. It was a really boring class. It was tech report writing. So you had to write like directions so that a monkey could do whatever job you're trying to explain. And he would literally come in and just blow off the first 10 minutes and kind of make wisecracks and make fun of people or whatever. And it would just really loosened up the class. And then he's like, all right, well, let's do some of this boring stuff. And we would. And I just was like, I love this guy's style. And again, he made it fun. So I've always tried to do that. So I remember when I was teaching like Excel, if I was just trying to teach a basic kind of equation, let's add these three things together, I would always look at my audience. And if I had people that were like in their 40s, that would be great, because they remembered the Three Stooges, which was this old comedy, black and white TV thing that a lot of those people that were in their 40s watched them when they were little kids. And I would say, okay, let's say your first customer is Larry and they don't see anything yet. And then I would say, and your second customer is Curly. Well, that was a clue that we're talking the Three Stooges now. And that would just get them kind of like, okay. And then it would just play on something they already knew and got everybody thinking about it, and somebody would start making a Three Stooges noise, and all of a sudden we're learning how to make a spreadsheet, but we're having fun at it. So anything I could do to add some sort of humor or make it fun or just not boring number crunching, it made it a little more fun. And by the end, they're like, I can't wait to take part 2 or part 3. And what was always really flattering is when I would hear somebody say, well, how many teachers do you have at this particular business? I'd say, oh, we have like 4 or 5. And they're like, can I request that you teach the class? I'm like, yes, you can. So that was always, for me, just like, okay, I must have done something right because they're requesting me. And I just always to me, it was like the 8 hours went a lot faster because some of this stuff was just ridiculously dry. And I'm like, oh, this is so boring. I got to find a way to spice it up a bit.
it does take time and energy on your part, on the trainer's behalf, to do that. And I think a lot of people do have the intention of delivering something that's really engaging and fun, but then they're so busy and caught up with life that they don't take that time investment to really think of examples like the Three Stooges, or do just little tweaks like that can really make a great training environment. So congratulations on having students that wanted you back for more.
Well, just one other thing I would do is I would just ask, introduce yourself and tell me what you do at your job. And that way, if they said, I don't know, I run the library at my company. So now when I'm coming up with an example, I can say, hey, well, if we're doing this and now you're doing something in your library and you need to, and I tie it into what they're doing, that always seemed to then, connect with your students in this case, or your audience, because you kind of know who you're talking to.
Yeah, and that's exactly right, and personalising it to who they are. So I guess you wouldn't really use the Three Stooges analogy around people a bit younger than me nowadays. But you knew that the people in your room are 40 years old, they grew up with it. It's an instant connection, and it makes people laugh already because it was a funny show.
Right.
So preparation, I'm wondering, I know you're talking in Washington this weekend, and I saw on your Facebook profile that you're practicing the speech about 20 to 30 times. Is that something that you usually do, or is it just for big stakes presentations?
It's just something I do every time, and I think the reason for that is, number one, you can make your slides, you can make your PowerPoint slides, and I do my best not to create death by PowerPoint. Instead, I have images that will inspire me. So in my head, I have the bullet points. I try not to have the bullet points on the screen. I want them in my head. And so I'll start with the slides, and then from there, it's like, okay, I know what's in my head. Do those words actually come out of my mouth, or have I made up bullet points that are tongue twisters and I didn't even realize it, and does it flow? And by doing this over and over and over, I don't know if it somehow triggers my subconscious or what, but inevitably, about 3 days before the event, I'll have an aha moment where I'm like, ooh, you know what? That would be a better explanation, or this would tie in nicely here, or this would be a transition, or something of that nature. And I've just found it's not a nervous thing, because what's hilarious is no matter how many times I rehearse it, about 2 minutes, like the minute they put a microphone on me, all the blood will rush out of my hands and they become just giant. Like I have 10 ice cubes for fingers, and that's just normal. That's what and I know that now. Now before I might go, oh, what's wrong? I'm really, really nervous. And I'm like, nope. Okay. Time to talk, because my hands have left the building. And I just, when that starts, the minute I start, that's when the nerves go away and I'm ready to start, and I launch into it and I know what's going to happen. And I've also realized that no matter how many times I rehearse it, somewhere in my presentation, I will call an audible. I will do something that was unplanned. So in Australia, we were doing a thing, and I was talking about how it took Jerry Seinfeld 17 years to become an overnight sensation. And I was watching my presentation, and I decided to go old man preacher guy. And I was like, everybody say 14, and the crowd went 14. And then later when I said it was 17 years, I go, everybody say years, and everybody's like years. Just something to do with interactive. That was absolutely not planned. It was just something I'm like, all right, this is going pretty good. What can I do here to make it a little more interactive? It was about halfway through the presentation. I got to do something to keep people awake. And so I just did that off the top of my head. That was not planned. And that used to kind of bug me, but I just know whatever's going to happen, that I'm going to have a plan, and somewhere in there, I'm going to try something. And the good news is about 90% of the time it works.
Yeah, I love that interactive part. And I think Tyson uploaded that video on Facebook. We might be able to share a copy of that on the show notes. But what it really did was really emphasize the point that to be an overnight sensation, it takes a lot of time, a lot of work, a lot of consistency and commitment. So I think by getting that audience interaction, you really made that point stick. I thought you absolutely killed it at We Are Podcast. You were one of, I think, the second last speakers on the second day, which is never an easy shift to pull. But for some reason, and it definitely was, you really raised the energy levels. And I kind of felt sorry for Pat Flynn, who was after you. I was thinking, geez, you're a hard act to follow. Everyone was in hysterics.
Well, here's the thing. There is a competitive side to me. And I always want to make whoever follows me There's this is even before my time, but back in the 60s, there was Woodstock and there was a band called The Who, and they would smash all their equipment, and they really did it in this instance. And the reason because that is somehow they had to flip a coin or whatever, but Jimi Hendrix had to follow them, and they were mad that they were not going on last. So they said, you know what, we're just going to make it so we're almost impossible to follow. So I love Pat Flynn, and I knew Pat Flynn was going to do great. There was nothing I could do to upstage Pat Flynn, but I wanted to make him sweat a little bit. And the other thing that dawned on me literally like 10 seconds before I started to speak was, hey, you know what? None of these people have ever seen me speak, because, the majority of them were from Australia. That really, really got me excited, because I was like, okay, I've got to do something here. And all I did is I forget what the point was, but I actually jumped up in the air. I said something like, people have to jump in the pool or something like that. And I remember I jumped and I looked up and, I can't remember her name, but she kind of like actually in her chair kind of jumped like, oh, there's movement here. And I was like, okay, this is fun. And so to me, I was like, now we're in my element and I've got their attention. Now I've just got to make sure I don't lose it.
Yeah, no, I actually remember looking across because I was sitting at the back and I was looking around and people were just crying with laughter. And I even think they're like, who is this guy? He's so funny. And you brought up the Woodstock and Jimi Hendrix. And I know that you're a bit musical as well and you've been part of a band. Has that sort of helped you as well with the stage presence and getting over that minute before the nerves and accepting that's just a normal part of the way that you perform?
Yeah, a little bit, especially the bigger the crowd, the bigger your movements have to be. I've played in front of thousands of people. We played a big outdoor festival, and it's not enough to just stand there and look at your sneakers. In fact, that drives me crazy when I go to see a live band and they're there standing there staring at their shoes and just playing. I like to look at my audience and make as much eye contact as I can and constantly move. In fact, if anything, I think sometimes I look more like a tiger at the zoo that's just pacing back and forth. But that's just, to me, I'm energetic. I'm ready to make a great first impression. And so I just don't want to stand there and talk. So I'm trying to do something to, just keep you going and avoid you looking at your phone. So any kind of big movement, I've done a couple of different presentations where I'm wailing my arms or I'm getting loud and then I'm getting soft, and anything to just break the dynamics, whether that's 1 minute I'm making a point and I'm talking really, really fast, and then the next minute I'm making my point and I'm accenting my words. So whether it's loud, soft, fast, slow, standing still, making a point. A great thing I learned from Chris Rock, who's a comedian, is Chris Rock will walk to the left of the stage and he'll say his point. And then I'm going to walk over here to the right side of the stage and make my point. And then when he walks to the middle, he'll say the punchline. And I was like, oh, that's kind of a cool technique. If you watch him do that, he does it all the time. And so anytime I'm trying to really make a point, I'm really like, this is the one you need to remember. If I was an old preacher guy, I'd be pounding the podium. I'll just do in my head, I'm like, let's do the Chris Rock. And I'll walk to the left of the side, I'll walk to the right side. But when it's time to make the main point, I will stop and look everybody straight in the eye and make that main point.
It really is about contrast. And I noticed that you do that with your voice, not only on the stage, but as part of School of Podcasting. I do notice that you change the tempo, the volume, which makes it really easy to listen to. And I like that you're also inspired by Chris Rock, who is a comedian. Just on the topic of humor, have you always been this funny, or have you had to work at this? Because it just seems that you come out with crazy funny things like every moment of the day.
I don't know. I think the biggest one, my mom was hilarious. My mom was the queen of puns growing up, and we were always trying to make each other laugh. And I always like to go right to the line, like, is this offensive or not? And I'm always asking myself, like, is this offensive or not? I remember once where we were talking about what makes a good podcast. And I said, it might be, what makes a good presentation. I said, you know what? Podcasting is like porn. You know it when you see it, or a good podcast is like porn. You know it when you see it, but you can't define it. So you might say that about a presentation, right? A great presentation, in the middle of it, you're like, this is awesome. But if you were to explain to somebody what is it, it's like, well, it's kind of this and that, but you just know it when you see it. But the fact that I used the word porn, I was like, ooh, am I going to offend somebody or like that? So I like to push it right to the edge, that just because I think by doing that, it kind of shows that I'm comfortable, that I'm going to say this kind of word in front of you. And I think hopefully that endears me to the audience that, okay, Dave's kind of letting his guard down. I'm going to let my guard down. And again, if their guard's down, well, then we can be a little funny with each other. And that funny then leads to, hey, we're actually learning stuff and we didn't even realize it because we're too busy laughing.
Yeah. It's like when you meet some people in the corporate world and everyone's dressed all, formally. And then if they come out and say something that's not politically correct, which I love that kind of humor, it really disarms both of you and you can actually have a really good conversation because, we're all human. I want to talk about the comfort zone. And I know that on the recent episode you spoke about We Are Podcast, and it was a big thing for you coming to Australia, first time out of the country in quite some time. Just want to share a bit about why it's worth kind of busting through the comfort zone. We have a lot of listeners that are first time presenters and they want to get more confident at getting in front of a room, but it's a little barrier they need to push through to get there. Is it worth pushing through?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's so many things that I look back now and go, I was scared to do something. And number one, it's never as bad as you think it's going to be. When I heard I was going to be on a plane for 17 hours, I pictured children on fire screaming and somebody behind me kicking my kidneys through the chair and just all sorts of just mayhem. And it was absolutely not that at all. So I think a lot of times we think about the worst case scenario, and it rarely ever is the worst case scenario. In fact, for me, it was like every time I turned around, it was like, oh, really? That was actually pretty cool. When I heard that the Roundsley, the guy that did the whole event and organized it, we had seating. We had assigned seating. And I'm like, but I want to sit with my friends and I'm going to end up sitting at a table with nobody. And if you scrape me all the way down and peel back the layers, I'm actually a little shy. And so the fact that I had to meet brand new people, it turned out to be great. I met all sorts of great people, but there was a part of me that was like, oh, this could be really awkward. I'm kind of shy. And so anything that you think is out of your comfort zone, I said this in my presentation. I said I was either going to end up with a great time, or if things went horrible, I was going to end up with a great story. And actually, in my case, I ended up with both. I had a great time, and I met all these great people, and I got to do all these new things. And so I ended up with a great time and a great story. And so just you can't – whether it's a presentation, you can practice all you want in the basement, but you don't know if it's any good until you do it in front of people. And that's the part, of course, that makes us want to wet our pants. But I love there's a presentation. There was this old country guy, George Jones. He was like this country legend in the States. And there was another country guy named Vince Gill, who's very, very popular, very, very talented. Well, these two people were friends. And so Vince Gill is trying to sing at George Jones's funeral, which right there is like, that's a tough act. And then he's singing a song that's super duper sad. So poor Vince gets through about, I don't know, half a verse before he literally just breaks down and cannot sing. And it's a duet. So his partner's still singing the harmony, but Vince is just over there trying to sing. And I think sometimes if we somewhat crash and burn on stage during our presentation, maybe the slide isn't working right, or we lost our place, or whatever reason, something in our head is going, oh, this isn't going well, and we think the audience is going to hate us. It's the direct opposite. Your audience wants you to succeed. So in this YouTube video, if you find it, you actually see where another country guy, Garth Brooks, stands up like, hey, we're here for you, buddy. I know you're having a hard time, but doggone it, we're here for you. And the entire audience stood up. And I was like, that is like one of the coolest things I've ever seen. And sure enough, he eventually kind of got it together and continued to sing. And so that's when I was like, there are many times when we're doing a presentation and things don't go well. I was this year, I was inducted into the Academy of Podcasters Hall of Fame. You had mentioned that. And you want to talk about practice. I must have practiced this speech 70 times. I had it in my phone. I had it almost memorized. And I'm going to say the fourth or fifth sentence out of my mouth just decided to leave. And I forget what I said, but it wasn't right. And I went to say something like chose, and instead I said choosin'. And I just laughed. And I said, okay, we're making up words tonight. And I heard my audience laugh. And I went, you know what, you idiot? You're standing in front of a whole audience full of your friends. What are you worried about? Just shut up and be you. And I knew that I was kind of like when that first mistake happens, because in my brain, I'm like, okay, there it is. There's the mistake. You can kiss perfect out the window. and let's continue on, because there's always going to be something that you go, all right, didn't mean to say that, or that didn't go right, or my mouth didn't work, or whatever. So at that point, it allowed me to kind of chill out and then just have this great presentation. So don't freak out when if you do something wrong. Nobody ever knows it. If we go back to me being a musician, nobody ever knows when you mess up playing a song unless you make a face and stomp your foot or something like that. So get out of your comfort zone, get out there and try it. And the more you do it, the better you'll be.
Yeah, I do think we put some unrealistic expectations on us to be perfect. But I think fudging your words on stage, I can see everyone sort of relaxing, you relaxing, and then you're just getting on with it. I think it's actually quite healthy to make errors. And like you said, if you're not crying in front of Garth Brooks, which I don't think any of us will be in that situation in future, what's the worst that can really happen? So you talked about having humor as a really important skill. Preparing is obviously something very important to you. What other kind of skills makes a really good trainer or facilitator or presenter?
I think it all goes back to kind of knowing who your audience is, because when you're teaching something, you're trying to get them to a spot that they've never been, whether it's some sort of new step-by-step thing or a new concept or whatever. So if you can kind of know who your audience is and know where they're at, well, then you know where they're at, you know where you want them to be. It's up to you to find out how to bridge that gap. And so if I'm in front of people, we'll just use the example of podcasting. If I'm trying to explain what podcasting is to somebody and I look up and they're 60 years old, I'm like, okay, that person understands radio. They grew up with radio. I'm going to use radio. And I will then say, okay, well, you know how you have a radio to tune into a station? And they'll say, yes. And I'm like, okay, well, your radio in the new world is like your phone. You have this app. And I'll just go through the whole thing. And I'm just, okay, do you understand this? Yes, this ties to that. And so just for me, I love analogies. And so anything I can do to help them kind of start where they're at, get to where they're at, and then ask them questions in some cases. Even if it's in a presentation, you can just say, are you with me with that? And does everybody understand that? Or you might even say, what would happen if I did this now? And somebody should say, well, Dave, you'd catch on fire. And you're like, exactly, you got it. Moving on. And just do a quick quiz to make sure they're with you, and then keep on going. Mm. And then what happens if you go, hey, what would happen if this happened? In your head, you're thinking they're going to say, Dave, you'd catch on fire. And nobody says anything. This is a fun one. It takes a lot of courage. Don't say anything, because that awkward pause is going to make somebody go, oh, he's actually looking for us to answer. And then you might even, if nobody answers, then you just go, well, would I catch on fire? Making it a yes or no question, which is even easier. And then if somebody says yes, and you're like, correct. Okay, moving on. But that's some of those things it takes a little courage to do, to have that awkward pause, or to ask them a question, or what if they don't interact here? And there's only one way to find out. And I think we all have that one presentation on occasion that you're like, oh, wow, that did not go the way I wanted it to. But most of the time, if you know who your audience is, you've practiced it, you're going to be fine.
Yeah, I love the that you mentioned the awkward pause. Sometimes it just feels like an eternity up there. It's like time to stand still, and you're praying someone just speaks up. But it is a good tactic, and if we can become more comfortable using that pause, and we're in the right direction, I think it definitely challenges. And someone in that room will get really awkward with it and just say something. So you do a lot of learning. You've got your teaching degree. Was there any sort of particular book, resource, advice, or podcast that really sort of stepped up your game? Or has it just been your experience, all that time on your feet in front of rooms, that's really helped you?
I think some of it goes back to, I like to reverse engineer. Like for me, I make content now all the time. And so I kind of sat back and said, well, what do I like, and why do I like it? And whether it's the news, or if it's a TV show, or a movie or whatever, I'm like, okay, that was really good. And then I go, why was that really good? And so for me, most of the stuff I consume either makes me laugh, cry, think, groan, educate, or entertain. Something in there that's going to do that. So I do that, and I try to always do one of those things and say, okay, in this slide, what am I doing? Or I'll come up with a main point for my entire presentation. I remember once I spoke at Podcast Movement, and my main point, my one sentence summary was, every podcast can benefit from editing. that was it. If somebody said, what's your presentation about? That was it. And then every slide reinforced that point. So whether it was, the fact that magazines have an editor and books have an editor, so why don't podcasts have an editor? But every slide was like reinforcing that main point. I think sometimes that if I get stuck on how am I going to do this, how am I going to attack this particular subject, I look back and go, okay, what's the one sentence? What's the one thing that I can boil this whole presentation down to? That's actually called, there's a book called, it's from the SCORE conference, Ken Davis, I want to say The Secrets of Dynamic Communication. Mm-hmm. It's all about speaking online. It's a great book. And he talks about that, having one sentence and then having all the slides reinforce that main point. Well, if your presentation has multiple points, that's fine, but use that same thing and say, okay, the next 5 slides are going to reinforce this point, and then I'm going to move on to this point. Okay, what's the one sentence? And just kind of boil it down, because sometimes, especially if you've ever been in the situation where you thought you had 30 minutes to speak, and then you show up and they go, oh yeah, and remember you have 20 minutes, and you're thinking, oh wow, I got to cut 10 minutes out. You go back to that one sentence. Okay, what's the main thing I'm trying to get across here? And then sometimes that will help you figure out what slides to cut.
That one sentence is very powerful, and it sounds like the way that you create a presentation is similar to the way that you need to sort of form an argument. So what is the point I want to get across, and then backing that up. And you also were a participant in the great debate at the podcasting conference this year, and your side, I believe, didn't win, unfortunately, but it was very entertaining.
Well, and what's fun about that is I've studied a little bit of improv, not a lot, but there's always that thing, because that was completely off the top of our head. We kind of had a little clue, but not really. I met with my other team members and we kind of said, here's some points we're going to hit, but I didn't know who was going to hit. I was going last, so I had no idea what was going to be left. And that's a case where you really think, oh, I can't just make something up. I'm here to tell you, your brain will find something to come out of your mouth. I worked with a guy who teaches improv, and he just kept throwing me these weird ideas. And I would think, I have no idea what to say. And somehow my brain would come up with something. So yeah, your brain's pretty powerful. And as long as you remember to breathe, that's another fun one. Because sometimes when we get a little nervous, then we start taking shallow breaths. Well, we're robbing our brain of something that it actually needs right now, which is oxygen, and that'll help keep you calm and kind of help you get through it. But yeah, don't be that was fun, because they said, here's what we're going to do, and I'm like, okay, again, getting out of my comfort zone. I'm like, so I'm going to do something. I'm going to argue a point in front of people. I'm not sure what I'm going to say. I'm not sure what my other teammates are going to say. Okay. And yeah, we did lose, but I had a lot of fun.
Oh, it was awesome. It was so much fun. It was like a bit of a roast, actually. Dave, fantastic point. So you spoke about improv, you spoke about your time, just having water cooler conversations and how that opened up an opportunity for you. How getting out of your comfort zone is super important, and just some incredible stories of things that have gone well and haven't gone so well, as well as you've thrown in some great analogies too. If people want to connect with you, see more of your stuff, see where you're at, listen to your podcast, where can they find you?
My main website is schoolofpodcasting.com, and all my contact information, everything you need, is over there at schoolofpodcasting.com.
Cool. And we'll link to all of that in the show notes. And Dave, I just love the excuse to give you a call and chat to you again. I really appreciate all the insight that you've given me and our audience today. And it was great catching up with you again post speakers retreat and podcasting conference, and all the best.
Thank you very much. It was a great talking to you.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of First Time Facilitator. Make it easy for yourself, and don't worry about having to find First Time Facilitator episodes ever again. If you just click that subscribe button in your podcast player of choice, that makes it really easy for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the show. You can either DM me on Instagram at First Time Facilitator, tweet me at Leanne Hughes, link up with me on LinkedIn. You can just search for Leanne Hughes, or join the Facebook group, The Flip Chart, and stay engaged with fellow listeners. Chat to you next week.